Okay, so time to fix our code and make it work again. And for that, first of all, I also connected to my MongoDB server with Compass again. And there I want to clear everything so that we can start from scratch essentially. And therefore, I will go to my shop database and simply delete that entire database. It will again be created on the fly or when required when we start inserting data. Now I got a problem. I connected with the wrong user where I'm not allowed to delete a database because I connected with a user who has only read or write access. So I'll just delete the collections here. Of course, the alternative would be to simply connect with a user where I am allowed to manage the overall database. But this will do for now. With that, I also implicitly got rid of the shop database, and now we can start working from scratch again. And let's start working with it by making sure that we can create products, and for now, products that will simply use very simple data without taking the user into account for now, and where we can simply add them through the admin controller. So I'll go to my product model, to the model file. And there I will eventually remove all the commented out code. I'll leave it here for reference for now. And first of all, in here, we need to import Mongoose. So I will require Mongoose here. Whoops, Mongoose, like this. Now with this imported, I'll create a new constant and I'll name it schema with a capital S. The name is up to you, but I will use something from the Mongoose object I imported. I will use the schema constructor here. This constructor allows me to create new schemas, and here I will create a new schema, a new product schema. You can also name this however you want. I create a new schema by instantiating a schema object by calling new schema using that constructor here. Now, this is just how Mongoose works, and to this constructor here, I pass a JavaScript object, and in that object, you now define how your product should look like. So you now define the data schema of a product in our case here. So this is how you set up such a blueprint. In that object, you define a schema with simple key value pairs. So for example, our product will have a title. Now you don't just define which keys you have, but also which type these keys will have. And that's important. And the type I define here would be string. String is a default JavaScript object, hence we can use that here. And this would say, okay, so here I create a schema for an object which I will eventually be able to work with, which must have or which will have a title that is of type string. Now important. In the MongoDB module, I mentioned that MongoDB is schemaless. So why do we now start to create schemas? Well, the idea simply is that whilst we have the flexibility of not being restricted to a specific schema, we often will have a certain structure in the data we work with. And therefore, Mongoose wants to give you the advantage of focusing on just your data, but for that, it needs to know how your data looks like. And therefore, we define such a schema for the structure our data will have. But important, we can still deviate from this. By assigning a title like this, we could even work with a product and create a new one and save it to the database without setting a title, because we still have the flexibility of not enforcing this. Though what we can do is we can pass an object instead of just the type here as a value, and then set a type property, which could be set to string, and then set required to true. This is basically a more complex way of configuring the value for this key. And here we would say, well, the type of this is a string, as before, but it's also required. And now we indeed give up some of the flexibility we had before, and we force all objects to have a title. But in the end, in our application, every product needs to have a title indeed, because we will run into other errors otherwise. For example, when outputting products in our views. So having some kind of schema makes sense, even though we have the flexibility to deviate from that. And it really just depends on your application, whether you need all that flexibility or whether you want to have some structure and you want to have some tool, Mongoose, that takes some structure and then helps you work with that data. So that was a lot of talking about schemas, but it is important that you understand why we now all of a sudden start working with them. It's just a deliberate decision to give up some flexibility, but gain other advantages. Now, of course, a product doesn't just have a title. We also need to have a price. And there we can set the type to number, for example, and then this would also be required. And we also want to have a description and an image URL. So we'll add a description here. This will be of type string, and let's say this is also required. Now, of course, you can always deviate from my setup here, but I want to require it all. And we'll have an image URL, and in that image URL, this will be of type string because it's just a URL, and this will also be required. So that would be my product schema. This is basically a description of how a product should look like in my application. Please note that I don't add _ID here because this will still be added automatically as an object ID. So we don't need to define that here. The user ID is something we'll add later. So now we got that product schema defined. In the next step, we will create a model based on the schema and then create an object based on the model and work with that.